Mother Nature doesn't understand money. However, human activity can be steered by money. That is why carbon pricing is important. Welcome to watch the sustainability trends in business, and this time we will discuss carbon taxes and emission trading. Why do we use fossils? The answer is very obvious: easy and cheap. No need to worry about storage or changing weathers, and especially coal is readily available in many places, easy to store. Low price, however, is an illusion due to externalities. So the external cost of putting carbon into the atmosphere. The cost of externalities is difficult to determine, but it is high. This is often called the social cost of carbon, SCC, sort of what we need to pay or what kind of damage does our current carbon use cause to the future economy, and then of course discounted that to today. Well, the Biden administration puts it at only $50 per ton. However, the US Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, which belongs to the Biden administration, puts it at $150 per ton. But a new paper from National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, which is a bipartisan non-political think tank in the US, that paper by Harvard and Northwestern University researcher puts the cost to over $1,000 per ton. And it's not the only one. It seems that the estimates of the external cost of using or spewing carbon into the atmosphere have gone up lately, and they are very high, ranging from several hundred euros per ton upwards. But as carbon emissions are a tragedy of the commons, I mean, if I emit carbon, of course I will suffer, but I won't suffer from that emission to any measurable degree. I will suffer from all the emissions, which means that if I cut my emissions and pay more, I won't get any benefit. So I'm not going to do anything. And the only way to solve tragedies of the common is to have some higher force steering the market. Usually it's called the government, but here we need something more global. And there are different ways of doing it. Of course, this can be done by just limiting certain activities, forbidding something, but then market mechanisms are not used to find a solution. It is, of course, politically attractive to forbid or limit activities which are not important to my voters, but they might be important to someone else's voters. But as an idealist, I don't really believe in point-like regulation unless there is a very, very strong justification to create such rules. I think good regulation is technology neutral and it uses market mechanisms. For example, putting a complete ban on coal wouldn't make sense because it's not technology neutral. It might be that there are some uses for fossil coal where it is actually justified to use it to some degree. But if we forget the politically motivated measures, there are essentially three different approaches to emission reduction: emission limits, carbon tax, and then carbon trade. Emission limits are simple. Each emission source receives a quota for maximum emissions. And as long as the quotas are enforced, it of course works because nobody emits more than allowed. And this is used with some success with other pollutants and it increases emission control technology. For example, it has been quite effective with ozone depletion, where there has been a ban on certain substances and strict limits to others. It's a success story. But this may not be that effective when the emissions are directly linked to benefit. So when we talk about ozone depletion and the emissions, we can use other substances instead of, for example, CFC, and that's possible. But when we talk about carbon emissions, most of our carbon emissions come from making energy, and finding alternatives is much more difficult. So there is no one-to-one replacement. We are talking about the core process of making energy. And another problem with limits is that there is no incentive to go below limits. It's enough to just pass the limit. If you're below it, you're happy. And this is of course a bad thing, because then we should take the limits down to zero at some point. There is no mechanisms to allocate reductions where it's least expensive, because everyone has their own quotas. And there is no flexibility when general economy changes. Even if you have very hot economy, you have a lot of customers and so on, your quotas are not going up whatever you do. And then again, if you have no production, your quotas are still the same. So they're not flexible. Quotas are not in wide use with carbon emissions for the aforementioned reasons, but the voluntary SBTi, Science-Based Targets Initiative, is actually a bit like this setting. Of course, it sets a hard limit. Breaking that doesn't necessarily cause any other damage than brand damage. Another possibility is carbon tax. The idea is to have a fixed amount of money per ton. For example, we could say that if the external cost of carbon is $1,000 per ton, then we set a tax of $1,000 a ton. Not very realistic, that level, I think. Well, tax is easy to understand, it's easy to implement, and it creates a steady cash flow to governments. But there is no allocation mechanism, so it doesn't take into account the fact that the benefit of doing something that creates emissions is different for different processes and different players. So there is no trading. There is no flexibility to economic changes, again, as with the hard limits, and there is no guarantee of emission reductions. While the limits, of course, guarantee reductions, taxes don't. And taxes are politically sensitive. There are gazillion reasons to tweak taxes. And the third option is cap and trade, auctioning. The idea is that there is a fixed quota for everyone, which is then auctioned to those who deem the carbon emissions most valuable for them. And it's flexible towards economic changes, of course. If it's low time, then there are less emissions and the emission cost goes down, which sort of works the right way, and it gives some flexibility and acts as a buffer against depressions and so on. Trading these emission certificates or quotas, it guarantees optimal allocation, at least if you believe what was taught in the Economics 101 regarding market economy. There are some issues that it doesn't always guarantee, but it pretty much works, and it provides significant public income until our emission quotas are at zero. But it also works at net zero, because then you can trade emissions to carbon capture at the same price point. Well, a great system, but not without trouble. Quota setting is difficult and politically sensitive. Of course, some politicians it would be quite attractive to not make the quotas very strict. The price is difficult to predict in the short term. This is sort of a result from the flexibility. Public income is zero at zero emissions, and very often, this is not actually the system per se, but very often cap and trade is baseline and credit type of system, in which case some of the polluters get free emission quotas, like baseline emission certificates, for free. And then it is sort of like the emission limit, a combination of the two systems. All three systems, hard limits, taxes, cap and trade, are prone to carbon leakage. Well, leakage means that any limit or tax will increase the cost of carbon-intensive products, right? So economies without such restrictions outside of the system will get an unfair advantage, because the costs don't apply to the players in those economies. And the production will move outside of the carbon trading area or whatever. And the end result is that by incurring price on carbon, we harm our own economy, and we get no benefit for the climate because the carbon emissions are leaked. Well, does this actually happen in reality? Most probably the answer is yes. But then does it render carbon limits or taxes useless? And again, most probably the answer is no, they don't. Because well, the actual amount of leakage is not known, but for the EU ETS, European Emissions Trading Scheme, the estimates of carbon leakage are around 20%. And EU ETS is the most expensive carbon tax in the world, wide-scale carbon tax in the world. So the leakage is not that big. But there is an interesting question. If we impose taxes on something, who is going to pay the tax? Is it the purchaser? Is it the producer? Well, tax increases production cost. You can look at it from that direction. And then the law of supply and demand predicts that there will be lower demand and higher price. In which case, the consumer and producer will split the cost. But what is the actual split? It depends on demand and supply flexibility. Let's look at it. Here, if both demand and supply are flexible, we get the simple situation where both pay the tax and the quantity goes down. So emissions are reduced and tax is split. On the other hand, we can have the situation where we have relatively fixed demand. In that case, the consumers have no choice. They have to consume whatever they're consuming. And in that case, there is no change in quantity because the consumers have no choice and consumers will pay the full tax. So then it's only a tax. It doesn't change the consumption. And of course, the opposite situation, if the supply is fixed but the demand is highly flexible, the producer pays the tax. Maybe this could be that if you happen to own an oil well which has a constant capacity, then your production is fixed. So, as a summary, if either consumer or producer has little choice, there is no change in quantity. Whoops. So this is just a tax, not something that will reduce the emissions. But the idea behind emissions trading means that there are a lot of options, there are alternatives. So now we took a look from the single producer's point of view, but competition will actually settle the price level. So the price level in most cases is actually fixed. In which case, suppliers pay the tax and the quantity decreases. And this is exactly what is sought after. So the high carbon intensity products are replaced by low carbon intensity products. Well, the real question is, if this is a realistic situation, are there always low carbon alternatives available at the same price point? No, not always. Most likely the price will go up. So the consumer will end up paying. The largest and most beautiful of the cap and trade schemes and any carbon taxes is the EU ETS emissions trading scheme. It has a baseline still, and this baseline, so the free quota, which depends on the sector. There are something called focus sectors. Isn't that a beautiful name, by the way? But the focus sectors are sectors that are prone to international competition and they get 100% free allowances. Well, 100% doesn't mean that there wouldn't be an incentive to reduce emissions because that's 100% at some time or compared to something, so it's a fixed limit. If you can go below that, you'll get all the benefit. If you go above that, you will pay. Other sectors, non-focus sectors, currently get 30% of baseline, so free quota, but that will fall to zero by 2030, so it's going to go away. And about 57% of the total allowances are auctioned, so they're not free quota, by governments. And governments actually get income from this, and this is something they sometimes forget to mention you, that actually this is a big income for European governments. It's about 50 billion euros in Europe today. But the ETS has been the most effective way of reducing emissions. ETS emissions have kept under cap, as of course they should be. And also the price of ETS has increased. It depends on whether you have high or low economy, but it's now between 60 and 100 euros per ton. The EU ETS is not without shortcomings, of course. The free allocation is large to avoid leakage, and worse, the ETS only covers about 40% of EU total emissions. The rest is called the effort sharing sector. And effort sharing means transport, building heating, unless it's done by electricity or district heating, agriculture, waste. These have not reduced emissions during the last decades. Then LULUCF, land use change, forestry is also excluded. And there is one criticism against the EU ETS, that it worsens the energy crisis and that the cost may rise uncontrollably, hindering industrial investments. It also gives huge windfall profits for hydroelectric producers that may be up to 20 billion euros per year. However, it should be remembered that it's not always the owner of the hydroelectric power plant who gets the money, because there are all sorts of PPAs and other arrangements regarding electricity sales. A couple of purely subjective comments on the ETS. I think the ETS is improving due to lowering baselines, and the worst shortcomings are being fixed. I was really afraid of politicians getting cold feet and letting sort of the quotas go up, but they didn't, so we have a clear path towards the future. And now we have on the table, we have something difficult called the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will most likely come to fix leakage, or at least part of it, but it's not simple, and making it neutral is quite difficult. ETS will become a major source of income to the EU, shifting the emphasis of taxation towards carbon taxes, which is a good thing, I think. The windfall is a true problem. It is a true problem, but fixing it might be next to impossible, so it might be that we need to learn to live with it. The system is prone to political pressure, but it has held up surprisingly well. And my conclusion is that the ETS is not perfect, it is getting better, and it is the best in the world by its results. Globally, ETS is not the only one. According to the World Bank, 53 national systems and 40 local systems exist. They are either taxes or ETS. This number increases slowly. The largest by volume is actually the China National Emission Trading Scheme, which covers about 10% of global emissions. The EU ETS is the second, 2.5%. Then there is California CAT, third, but it's only about 0.5% of global emissions. And there are overlapping systems. You can find some pretty near. For example, Finland has the EU ETS for energy production, but also carbon tax on fuels. Germany has separate emissions trading scheme on fuels, and there will be European-wide ETS for fuels, and that will most probably be separate from the general ETS. The price levels vary a lot. The EU ETS at 60 to 100 euros per ton is the most expensive of the large ones. The China National, which is large in quantity, but it's only 12 euros per ton. And then the Japanese, the rich Japanese, their carbon tax is about 1.9 euros per ton, which means nothing. But it's easy to see that we need a global carbon trading scheme. That is the end goal. Negotiating it might be a bit difficult. It's a difficult discussion.
My carbon cost is 100 euros per ton. You don't pay anything. Unfair. Let's have global carbon trade.
No, we cannot agree on terms. My system is better than yours.
Let's have carbon tariffs. If you import something here, you'll pay 100 euros per ton for the emissions.
How would you determine the amount of emissions in a roll of steel?
Let's use the highest quartile emissions of global steel industry.
Completely unfair. I'll sue you for violation of WTO rules.
Sue me. I'll win because GATT Article 2, Clause 2 states that I may use border adjustments to impose charges equivalent to
Enough
domestic
of that.
taxes.
So on and so forth. If you like it, just choose a diplomatic career and go to the talks. But the positive note here is that the pressure is increasing and border adjustment mechanisms will come. They will bring more and more countries to the game, because more and more countries will understand that joining one of the big ETS areas is the best way to go. I do believe that cap and trade is the way to go, but I'm a realist though. I understand it will take a lot of time. It's not going to be here this year, next year, or even next decade. But I hope it won't take too long, because it's a very powerful mechanism. This is all for this episode. See you next time.